Eleanor of Aquitaine, born around 1122, one of the most powerful and influential figures of the Middle Ages. As the Duchess of Aquitaine, she was the most eligible heiress in all of Europe at the time, and her marriage to Louis VII made her the Queen of France. However, their marriage was annulled in 1152, so she swiftly married Henry II of England, and thus became the Queen of England. Her court in Poitiers was famed for its cultural richness, and was considered a center of troubadour poetry and godly love, everything quintessentially medieval. Eleanor played a crucial role in managing the vast Angevin Empire, which stretched across England, France, and parts of Spain. She was also a patron of the arts, and is credited with fostering the chivalric ideals of the time, a legacy that includes not only her contribution to the arts, but also her formidable influence on European politics through her direct role in the governance of her lands and her participation in the Second Crusade. Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, good to meet you, and if you're coming back, it's great to have you with me again. As always, if you want to support the channel, you're already doing it. The best way is to watch and enjoy the videos. Those who want to go above and beyond may refer to the description of the video. And now, it's going to be a very long video indeed, so make yourself comfortable, and we can begin our full biography of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine was born into a distinguished lineage of dukes, going by the name of William, who had ruled the region of Aquitaine since the 10th century, after the Carolingian monarchs. By the 12th century, Aquitaine was an extensive, though vaguely defined region of present-day France, stretching from the Loire River in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Massif Central in the east. It was during this time that Aquitaine was among the richest, and consequently most influential states under the French crown, in stark contrast to the smaller domain controlled by the French kings around the Ile-de-France. The loyalty of the neighboring dukes and counts to the French throne was therefore more formal than actual. Details about Eleanor's earliest years and schooling are subject to a fair bit of speculation, given the lack of concrete information about aristocratic households of that era. The earliest records mentioning Eleanor date to July of an unspecified year, though it's commonly believed that she was born during her parents' visit to Bordeaux, potentially in her father's castle near Belin. Other speculated birthplaces include Poitiers, Bordeaux's Ombriere Palace, or Nil-sur-Lotis. Initially estimated at 1122 or 1124, Eleanor's birth year is more convincingly set around 1124 due to the late 13th century genealogical records, and also her age at the time of her death. It is these records that indicate that she was 13 at the time of her father's death in 1137, supporting the 1124 birth year. While there are references to a loyalty oath from the Aquitaine lords on her 14th birthday, her parents likely did not marry before 1121. Her death is noted as either 80 or 82 years old, but we're not going to skip that far ahead. Eleanor was the eldest of 3 children of William X, who was the Duke of Aquitaine, and Eleanor de Châtellerault, the daughter of Aimery I, the Viscount of Châtellerault, and his wife, Dangerot de l'Île-Beauchard, who was also the long-term mistress of William IX. Well, named after her mother, she was baptized as Eleanor, derived from the Latin alia, Aenor, meaning the other Aenor. The name evolved into Eleanor in the northern French languages to Eleanor in English, though the spelling varied throughout her life. Little is known about her educational background. Following the death of her mother and brother in 1130, when she was only 6 years old, the only noted comment on her education comes from the troubadour Bertrand de Born, who mentioned her reading poetry in her native language. Now, Eleanor had initially spoke Poitevin, which is a dialect of northern French langue d'oil, but she was soon introduced to Occitan, the language of the southern poets and courtiers at the Aquitaine court. Following the deaths of her mother and brother, Eleanor became the primary heir to her father's vast domains. Aquitaine, the largest and wealthiest French province at the time, spanned an area equivalent to 19 modern French departments, and about a third of what is considered France at the time. In 1137, Duke William X embarked on a journey from Poitiers to Bordeaux, bringing his daughters along with him. Upon their arrival in Bordeaux, he entrusted them to the care of Geoffrey de Leroux, the Archbishop of Bordeaux, at the Ombriere Castle. The Duke then continued on to the shrine of St. James of Compostela, with other pilgrims, but died there on the 9th of April that year, being Good Friday. Not so good for him, I'm afraid. Well, at the age of 13, Eleanor suddenly became the Duchess of Aquitaine, making her one of the wealthiest and most sought-after heiresses in Europe. Aware of the risks of her potential abduction for her wealth and title, William X, anticipating his death, entrusted his daughters and their inheritance to King Louis VI of France, requesting that the king protect his lands and also find a suitable husband for Eleanor. Until her marriage, the king would have control over her lands. The Duke also ordered his companions to keep his death a secret, until they informed King Louis they were to travel quickly from Compostela across the Pyrenees, stop at Bordeaux to inform the Archbishop, and then hasten to Paris to notify the king. King Louis VI of France, also known as Louis the Fat, and of course in declining health, hence the name, of course, saw this as an opportunity to expand his domain. His son, Louis, originally destined for the monastery, became the heir apparent after his older brother Philip died in a riding accident in 1131. The death of Duke William opened up the possibility of acquiring the rich Duchy of Aquitaine. Thus King Louis, eager to increase the royal domain, which was relatively small, recognized the advantage of securing Eleanor's allegiance through marriage to his son. He understood that the urgency of settling Aquitaine's succession swiftly and the strategic benefits of the union. Consequently, he quickly arranged for his son Louis, accompanied with a significant entourage of about 500 French knights, along with notable figures like Geoffrey II, Bishop of Chartres, Theobald II, the Count of Champagne, and Raoul de Force, the Count of Vermandois, to travel to Bordeaux together. Their mission was to formalize the marriage and thereby secure the vast resources of Aquitaine for the Capetian dynasty, a move that was aimed to ensure a smooth transition and prevent any potential challenges to Eleanor's inheritance and her strategic marital alliance. Very little is documented about Eleanor's time as the Queen of France. She married Louis on July the 25th, 1137, in Bordeaux's Cathedral of Saint Andre, officiated by the Archbishop of Bordeaux. Right after their wedding, Eleanor and Louis were proclaimed Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine. It was decided that Aquitaine would remain autonomous until Eleanor's eldest son became both the King of France and the Duke of Aquitaine, ensuring that her estates would not merge with the French crown until the next generation. As a wedding gift, Eleanor presented Louis with a rather ornate rock crystal vase. Following their marriage, the couple traveled to Poitiers, where they celebrated with a week of festivities and were invested as Count and Countess of Poitou on August the 8th. However, Louis's time as the Count of Poitou and the Duke of Aquitaine was brief. As they journeyed towards Paris, they received the news that Louis VI had passed away on August the 1st, making them the new King and Queen of France. Louis had been crowned king in 1131, and Eleanor was crowned Queen of France on Christmas Day in 1137 in Bourges. Eleanor was not well received by certain members of the court, among them being Abbot Suger and Louis's mother Adelaide of Maurienne, who subsequently left the court and remarried. Some courtiers actually unfavorably compared Eleanor to Constance of Arles, another southern queen known for her unorthodox dress and speech. Thus Eleanor faced criticism from church leaders like Bernard of Clairvaux and Sugar for her behavior, which they considered to be improper. The Cite Palace in Paris, that's a hard one to say, underwent modifications to accommodate her preferences, and her sister, Aelith, known as Petronilla, joined her there. The redecoration was not well received either, but you know what they say, you must turn a house into a home. The succession of the county of Toulouse, now that was a complex issue. Eleanor was a descendant of the Counts of Toulouse through her grandmother, Philippa, who was the Countess of Toulouse. Philippa was the only child of William IV of Toulouse, but upon his death in 1093, his brother Raymond IV claimed the title. Philippa and her husband, William IX of Aquitaine, fought for her rights, a conflict that lasted nearly 3 decades until 1123, when Raymond IV's son, Afonso Jordan, took control. Eleanor inherited this claim from her father, William X of Aquitaine. In 1141, Louis VII tried to enforce Eleanor's claim by marching to Toulouse and laying siege to the city on June the 21st. However, they failed to take the city and withdrew after receiving homage from Count Alfonso. Despite this setback, Eleanor persisted in her asserting claims, leading to her further expeditions in 1159 and throughout the course of her later life. Louis VII of France frequently clashed with the Church and Pope Innocent II during his reign. In 1140, he intervened in the election of the Bishop of Poitiers, Grimoald, who was consecrated without Louis's consent, despite his father granting this right to the province of Bordeaux. Louis attempted to prevent Grimoald from entering Poitiers, drawing both Pope Innocent II and Bernard of Clairvaux into the dispute. The conflict ended when Grimoald finally died, but Louis's interference in ecclesiastical matters did not end there. The Archbishopric of Bourges became vacant in 1141, and Louis quickly nominated his chancellor, Cadoc, while blocking the candidacy of Pierre de la Châtre, who was elected by the canons of Bourges and consecrated by the Pope. Louis barred Pierre from entering Bourges, prompting the Pope to recall William X's attempts to replace church officials with those loyal to him, hinting Eleanor may be influencing these actions. In fact, the Pope went so far to describe Louis as a foolish schoolboy meddling in church affairs. His words, not mine. Say that to my face, why don't you? Louis swore that Pierre would never enter Bourges as long as he lived, leading to an interdict on his lands and Pierre finding refuge with Theobald II, the Count of Champagne. Louis's relationship with Theobald was already strained at this point, and the Bourges affair exacerbated this. The situation got worse when Raoul I, Count of Vermandois, and the king's seneschal left his wife, Eleanor of Champagne, for Petronilla, Eleanor of Aquitaine's sister. Louis approved an annulment and remarried Raoul to Petronilla, which angered Theobald and led to protests from Bernard of Clairvaux, and a papal council that annulled the marriage and excommunicated everybody involved. Despite this, Louis refused to recognize the council's rulings and invaded Champagne in a conflict lasting from 1142 to 44. The siege of Vitry in 1143 turned particularly tragic when a fire in the cathedral killed over 1,000 people that were seeking refuge. Shocked by the devastation, Louis sought peace with Theobald. With the Pope's intervention, a peace deal was eventually brokered, but Raoul's refusal to leave Petronilla led to further conflict. Public opinion and influential figures like Bernard of Clairvaux and Sugar pushed for a resolution, and Pope Celestine II's succession led to more conciliatory efforts. It was during these times that rumors about Eleanor's influence and behavior began to circulate, portraying her as involved in dark arts and affairs, notably with Geoffrey of Anjou. Discussions about the consanguinity of Louis and Eleanor's marriage also arose, with Louis having opposed similar issues in other marriages. Finally, peace was restored in 1144 in St. Denis, facilitated by Bernard, who convinced Eleanor to abandon her support for her sister. Despite the couple's continued excommunications until 1148, the peace agreement validated Raoul and Petronilla's marriage, and saw Louis withdrawing opposition to the Archbishop of Bourges. Discussions about Eleanor's apparent infertility also emerged, with suggestions that a child might follow her concessions. In April of 1145, Eleanor did give birth to a daughter, Marie, and in 1144, the month of June, Louis and Eleanor attended the dedication of St. Denis, where Louis donated that crystal vase as a peace offering. Louis VII's deep remorse over the tragic massacre at Vitry led him to contemplate a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. However, his plans were preempted by pressing matters closer to home. The success of the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, I have a whole video on it, by the way, had resulted in the creation of 4 crusader states in the Outre-mer, Outre-mer being the word for overseas. Well, these were now under the threat after the Zengi and Saracen Turks captured the region of Edessa, which was one of the Frankish states. On December the 24th, 1144, this loss had made the neighboring states of Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem as vulnerable as they were nervous, with Antioch, ruled by Eleanor's uncle Raymond of Poitiers, being particularly at risk. In late 1145, Louis received envoys from the beleaguered Outre-mer, and appeals were also directed to Pope Eugene III. On December the 1st, the Pope issued a bull urging Louis and all faithful Christians in France to undertake a crusade to the endangered states, promising a full remission of sins for those who participated. Basically, it was a get-out-of-jail-free card. Well, Louis, alongside Eleanor, was in Bourges when this call to arms reached them. Louis immediately declared on Christmas Day his intention to lead the crusade. Due to the lack of enthusiasm, among the French nobility, Louis delayed further planning until Easter 1146, enlisting Bernard of Clairvaux to support the crusade at a gathering in Vézelay on March the 31st. Eleanor of Aquitaine took up the cross during Bernard's sermon, indicating her commitment to join the crusade, despite having to leave her daughter behind. She also rallied women from the Aquitanian nobility and around 300 other volunteers. Now, while it was not uncommon for women to participate in crusades, their inclusion was more often than not met with a good deal of criticism, particularly from clerics and other members of the religious orders who may have been influenced by the later accounts of figures like William of Newburgh. Well, either way, by February of 1147, the planning phase had commenced at Étampes, revealing that Emperor Conrad III would also join the crusade. Requests for safe passage through neighboring lands were sent out, and final arrangements were made at St. Denis over Easter, where the Pope appointed Sugar as the regent of France, assisted by Ralph of Vermandois in Louis's absence. Eleanor's decision to join the crusade further fueled her detractors, who spun tales of her and her ladies departing as Amazonian warriors. On the 11th of June, the crusade set out from St. Denis with a force of 25,000 or perhaps up to 50,000 crusaders and pilgrims, depending on what source or estimation you read. They traveled through Metz, crossed the Rhine at Worms, and continued to Regensburg and along the Danube. They met envoys from the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos and followed the river through Hungary to Belgrade, reaching the Eastern Empire by mid-August. By October the 4th, 1147, they had arrived in Constantinople, where they awaited their seafaring companions. In Constantinople, the French received hospitality from Emperor Manuel Comnenos, with Louis and Eleanor staying in the Philippatian palace. Meanwhile, the German contingent of the Crusade had already crossed into Asia Minor. Once regrouped, the French crossed into Asia on October the 15th, heading south towards Nicaea. Learning that the Germans had suffered a significant defeat at Dorylaeum, the French opted for a safer coastal route to Ephesus, passing through Pergamus and Smyrna, arriving on December 20th. After a brief stay in Ephesus, Conrad and most of the Germans returned to Constantinople by sea, leaving the French to continue their journey. In January 1148, Louis VII made the decision to take an island route towards Laodicea in Phrygia, aiming for a faster path to Antioch via Antillia on the southern coast. They arrived at Laodicea on January the 6th, and then proceeded across the mountainous terrain. During their ascent of Mount Cadmus, one of the highest peaks along their path, Louis managed the rear of the column, safeguarding the unarmed pilgrims and the baggage, while the vanguard, led by Geoffrey de Rancon of Aquitaine and Amadeus III, the Count of Savoy, pushed ahead to the next valley, considering it a superior site to stay the night. This decision left the main body of the column isolated, and thus made them easy targets for a Turkish ambush. The ensuing Battle of Mount Cadmus saw the Turks inflict heavy losses on the French Crusaders. Louis barely escaped, apparently using tree roots to scale up a cliff face, a moment described by Odo of Deul as a divine provision for his safety. However, many were not as fortunate, with Odo lamenting the lack of heavenly aid, except for the coming of night. The chronicler William of Tyre suggested that the disaster was partly due to the excessive baggage purportedly carried for Eleanor and her ladies, and the inclusion of too many non-combatants. Louis's lack of effective leadership and poor tactical decisions contributed to the fiasco. Officially, Geoffrey de Rancon was blamed for the decision to move the camp, but many viewed Eleanor as the true culprit, given Geoffrey was her vassal. This incident further eroded Eleanor's popularity within the Christian ranks, as she was also faulted for the large baggage train and the positioning of her Aquitanian troops. By the 20th of January, the battered and bruised survivors reached Antalya. There they found a shortage of ships and exorbitant fares, leading only the royal party and a few followers to sail out, arriving in Antioch on March 19th. The others? Well, only half of them made it to their destination. It's a rough journey, to say the least. Upon their arrival in Antioch, tensions quickly surfaced between the Crusaders and Raymond of Antioch. Raymond's strategy focused on attacking Aleppo to regain Edessa, which conflicted with Louis's goal of proceeding directly to Jerusalem. However, Louis's forces were significantly weakened, and he had his own personal motives for wanting to continue to Jerusalem. Eleanor's strong ties to her uncle Raymond stirred discord between her and Louis. By March the 28th, amidst Eleanor's objections, the French departed Antioch, now reduced to a tenth of their original number. This departure sparked further debate about the consanguinity between Louis and Eleanor, with John of Salisbury suggesting Eleanor instigated these discussions. Upon reaching Jerusalem in May, the Crusaders were welcomed by Queen Melisende and King Baldwin III. At a strategy meeting in Acre on the 24th of June, they decided to lay siege to Damascus on July 24th, 1 month later, a decision that led to a quick and embarrassing retreat, and effectively marked the end of the Crusade. Well, despite all of this, Louis vowed to remain, digging his heels in until Easter 1149, against the advice of Sugar, his regent. The stay in Antioch and the resultant friction between Eleanor and Louis led chroniclers like John of Salisbury and William of Tyre to suggest an affair between Eleanor and Raymond. This accusation became a permanent part of Eleanor's legend, with some versions even claiming she had liaisons with a Saracen leader, but citation certainly needed on that one. Of course, all of the accusations were propped up by the people who were trying to find anything they could to throw at her. Something has to stick eventually, right? Well, contemporary accounts indicate that Eleanor's involvement in political matters was seen as the most controversial aspect of her conduct, and certainly a good way to make a lot of enemies, become a politician. Well, in the spring of 1148, Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine departed from Acre to Italy, each aboard separate ships. Their journey faced immediate challenges, however, including hostile naval forces near the Peloponnesus in May, and severe storms that diverted Eleanor's ship to the Barbary coast. Louis arrived in Calabria on July the 29th, only later discovering that Eleanor had been given refuge by King Roger II of Sicily in Palermo. While at the king's court in Potenza, Eleanor learned about the tragic fate of her uncle Raymond, who was beheaded by Nureddin's forces at the Battle of Inab on June 29th. This news marked a significant setback for the Crusaders' objectives, of course. Choosing not to return directly to France, Louis and Eleanor journeyed north to Rome, making a stop at the Abbey of Monte Cassino on the 4th of October, due to Eleanor's illness. Pope Eugenius III welcomed them at his Tusculum Palace, where they arrived on October the 9th. During their stay, Pope Eugenius, already informed about the couple's marital discord and an apparent lack of physical intimacy, upheld the legitimacy of their marriage under canon law and encouraged reconciliation. It is believed that during this period, Eleanor conceived her second child. The couple then traveled through Italy, revisiting Rome, and crossed the Alps back to France, arriving back home in Paris on November the 11th, 1149, after being away for 2.5 years. Certainly a long holiday. Well, by the summer of 1150, Eleanor had given birth to their second daughter, Adelicia. The absence of a male heir after 13 years of marriage, and Eleanor being 26, raised concerns about the future of the Capetian line. The death of Abbot Sugar in January of 1151, a supporter of the marriage, shifted the balance, as Bernard of Clairvaux and others viewed the marriage's consanguinity critically. Later that year, Henry Plantagenet, the new Duke of Normandy, visited the Parisian court. Chroniclers later suggested an encounter between Henry and Eleanor that played a role in the dissolution to her marriage to Louis. Well, that's just a suggestion. Either way, by this time, Eleanor's influence and reputation were well and truly in decline. In the autumn of 1151, the couple toured Aquitaine, removing French garrisons, replacing them with Eleanor's loyalists. On the 11th of March, 1152, at the castle of Beaugency, a synod presided by Hughes de Toucy, Archbishop of Sens, considered the annulment, with both Louis and Eleanor present. Archbishop Samson of Reims represented Eleanor, who did not contest the proceedings. On March 21st, the archbishops, with the approval of Pope Eugenius, annulled the marriage on the grounds of consanguinity. Eleanor and Louis were third cousins once removed, while their daughters were then declared legitimate, as children from marriages annulled in good faith were not at risk of being declared illegitimate. So that was good luck for them. Well, custody of the daughters was granted to Louis, as per custom and law, and Archbishop Samson ensured that Eleanor's lands were returned to her. While Eleanor cited reasons of kinship as the grounds for the annulment, the event fueled further speculation about her character and added to the legends surrounding her life. The narratives of her as a scorned wife, though lacking evidence, persisted in popular lore. Well, after her annulment, Eleanor faced potential threats due to her status as a wealthy, single woman. She traveled from Beaugency towards her court in Poitiers. During her journey, she narrowly avoided 2 kidnapping attempts. The first attempt was by Theobald V, the Count of Blois, who tried to seize her in Blois on the night of March 21st. Eleanor escaped by taking a boat down the Loire River to Tours. The second attempt was by Geoffrey Plantagenet, who planned to capture her at Port de Pile, on the border of Touraine and Poitou. Forewarned in Tours about Geoffrey's plan, Eleanor altered her route, avoiding the usual river crossings, and proceeding downstream to the confluence of the Creuse and Vienne rivers. By avoiding the main roads, she arrived safely in Poitiers by boat. Upon her arrival in Poitiers, just before Easter, Eleanor quickly sent envoys to Henry, the Duke of Normandy, and the older brother of Geoffrey Plantagenet, inviting him to marry her. This swift proposal suggests that there might have been a prior arrangement during Henry's previous visit to the French court. And marrying Henry would not only secure her lands in Aquitaine, but was also a strategic alliance, since Anjou was adjacent to Aquitaine to the north. Eleanor then began to revoke all the decrees Louis had made regarding Aquitaine and replace them with her own. Henry received her proposal by April the 6th and reached Poitiers by mid-May. On May 18th, 1152, just 8 weeks after her annulment, Eleanor and Henry were married in a private and hastily arranged ceremony at Poitiers Cathedral, transferring her Aquitaine lands from Louis to Henry. The secrecy of the ceremony was intended to prevent Louis from intervening. Eleanor and Henry were related more closely, actually, than she and Louis had been, as third-degree cousins through their mutual ancestors, Ermengarde of Anjou and King Robert II of France. This rapid remarriage added to the scandalous rumors about Eleanor, suggesting she had a previous relationship with Henry. Well, when Louis VII discovered that Eleanor had married his rival Henry, he was more than a little bit annoyed. Knowing that Henry was also a contender for the English throne, Louis immediately flew off the handle and prepared for war. He refused to relinquish his title as Duke of Aquitaine, which now belonged to Henry by marriage. This led to Louis's invasion of Normandy, sparking an extended conflict between the Angevin and Capetian dynasties that would last for over 50 years. Well, as the Duchess of both Aquitaine and Normandy, Eleanor wielded considerable power, issuing charters and adopting new titles that reflected her expanded role. Shortly after their marriage, Henry left to pursue his claim to the English throne, dealing with Louis's invasion, which he quickly repelled. By the fall, Henry had returned to Aquitaine, where the couple installed a stained-glass window in Poitiers Cathedral to commemorate their marriage. By late 1152, they had moved to Rouen in Normandy. In January 1153, Henry sailed for England, leaving the pregnant Eleanor with his mother, Empress Matilda, and his brother William. Their first child, William, was likely born in Angers on August 17, 1153. In England, Henry negotiated a truce with King Stephen at the Treaty of Winchester in November of 1153, agreeing that he would be Stephen's heir. This was confirmed at Westminster during Christmas, and upon his return to France, Henry and the again pregnant Eleanor saw a more cooperative Louis VII, who had reconciled with them and relinquished his claim on Aquitaine. King Stephen of England passed away on October 25, 1154, making Henry the new ruler, now Henry II. Although summoned immediately, they did not cross the English Channel from Barfleur until December the 7th, landing near Southampton near the following day. First, they visited Winchester to meet Theobald, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had served as regent. From there, they moved to London, taking residence at the Royal Palace in Bermondsey. Henry was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on December the 19th, 1154, with Eleanor sitting by his side. The ambiguity does remain, however, about whether Eleanor was crowned or anointed again, since she had already been crowned as the Queen of France in 1137. Well, either way, this event marked the start of the Plantagenet dynasty, which would govern England until the late 15th century. As Queen of England, Eleanor was granted numerous dower lands and regular financial allowances, effectively making her one of the kingdom's wealthiest individuals. Little about her activities during Henry's reign is recorded by chroniclers, who mainly noted her presence in relation to the king. Biographies have been constructed based on these itineraries and surviving official records, such as letters, writs, and charters. Furthermore, the autonomy of queens had been diminishing before her ascension. However, she did take part in the ceremonial occasions, like the Easter or Christmas courts, even though she had never managed to master the English language, which of course was very different in those days. Well, Henry's domain stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, and he was often away, travelling more than any predecessor. During these absences, Eleanor often acted as regent or co-regent with the justiciar. Although she sometimes accompanied Henry, she also travelled widely across her domains alone, or perhaps with her children. While claims about her as a patron of the arts are likely exaggerated somewhat, many writers did dedicate works to her, such as Robert Wace's Roman de Bru, and works by William of Blois. Others, like Mary de France, seemed inspired by her, associating her with Arthurian legends of later and former times. Now, on the 28th of February 1155, Eleanor gave birth to their second child, Henry, while the king was away. On January the 10th, 1156, Henry left for one of his many prolonged absences, with Eleanor pregnant again. That spring their son William died, and was buried at Reading Abbey. But in June, their third child, Matilda, was born, and Eleanor travelled to France to join Henry, returning to England in February of 1157. In September, their fourth child, Richard, was born at Beaumont Palace. After 1156, Eleanor's independent rule over her duchy diminished, with her name disappearing, except to confirm Henry's acts. By 1157, Louis VII had remarried and had another daughter, Margaret. Henry II, noticing Louis's lack of a male heir, planned to acquire the French throne by marrying his son Henry to Margaret. He went to France in the August of 1158 to negotiate and took Margaret into his care. He thus stayed away for 4 years, and during this time Eleanor gave birth to their fourth son, Geoffrey, on September the 23rd, 1158, and soon after went to France to join Henry. In 1159, they attempted to enforce Eleanor's claim to Toulouse, straining relations with Louis VII again, as Raymond V of Toulouse was Louis's vassal and relative. Although Henry formed a coalition to conquer Toulouse, Louis aided Raymond. Among Henry's allies was Raymond Berengar IV of Aragon, symbolizing alliances by betrothing his son Richard to Raymond Berengar's daughter. By September, Henry was forced into a truce, marking the start of a 40-year Anglo-French conflict. Eleanor returned to England in December, secured funds for Henry's campaigns, and escorted them to France before returning. In September 1160, Henry II called Eleanor and their children to join him in France after an extended period apart. In that same year, Louis VII's second wife had passed away, leaving him with only daughters and no male heir. He thus quickly remarried, and Henry saw this as an opportunity to secure alliances by arranging the marriage of Prince Henry and Margaret, despite their young age. And this was also without Louis's knowledge. Well, Eleanor stayed in France, and in September 1161 she gave birth to their daughter Eleanor in Domfront, Normandy. The gap between Geoffrey's birth in 1158 and Eleanor's in 1161 led to speculation about another child, Philip, who John Speed mentions, but whose existence remains unverified. Eleanor and Henry returned to England on the 25th of January 1163, concluding her regency. By February 1165, Henry was again on the continent arranging the marriages of their daughters Matilda and Eleanor to strengthen ties with the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Eleanor joined him in May, acting as his regent in Anjou and Maine. There she gave birth to Joan in October at Angers, with Henry returning to England shortly after her arrival. During these periods, the royal couple seldom saw each other, with Henry joining Eleanor in March 1166, only after she requested his assistance to quell potential revolts. The time of separation fueled rumors about Henry's infidelities, notably his affair with one Rosamund Clifford, which became public by late 1166 and was acknowledged by 1174. But Eleanor's response to these affairs, well, it was seemingly indifferent. In fact, she even raised Geoffrey of York, the illegitimate son that Henry acknowledged, at Westminster. Well, after Joanna's birth, Eleanor had stayed at Angers, with Henry not joining her for Christmas, but arriving by Easter when she conceived their last child, John. They spent Christmas 1167 together at Angers, and in 1168 Eleanor brought 11-year-old Matilda to the continent for her marriage to Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony. Henry's relationship with Thomas Becket also deteriorated during this period, beginning in 1163. Becket, who was once a close ally and the Archbishop of Canterbury, sought Eleanor's help during his exile in France from 1164, though she appeared to favor reconciliation. In December of 1167, Eleanor moved her possessions to the Argentan and celebrated Christmas there before moving to Poitiers. Henry accompanied her, then left to deal with the Lusignan family's rebellion. Eleanor was left in charge, showcasing her governance skills until 1173, hinting at a potential marital discord. Well, by 1168, Eleanor, who was 44 years old at that time, had finished up her childbearing years, having borne 8 children, including 3 future kings. Louis VII's son, Philip Augustus, born in 1165, ended Henry's hopes of adding the French throne to his empire through alliances. In 1163, Henry's ongoing feud with Becket had begun, straining their friendship and political alliance. Becket's attempts to involve Eleanor were minimally documented, with evidence suggesting that she was in the middle of them advocating for peace. Well, after gathering her possessions in December 1167, she moved to Aquitaine for Christmas, and then proceeded to Poitiers, her governance base amidst Henry's military campaigns. Her leadership in Poitiers lasted until 1173 rather, enhancing her role in managing Aquitaine's rebellious vassals. This period marked the end of Eleanor's direct involvement in the English regency, as she shifted focus to managing her continental domains. Her influence and the couple's intermittent separations fed into the narratives of their strained marriage, further complicated by Henry's known infidelities, and Eleanor's pragmatic management of their shared political responsibility. During the 5 years that followed their separation, speculation about the motives behind Eleanor and Henry's distance, whether for political strategy, growing estrangement, or a mix of both, has been widespread. Eleanor had indeed performed her royal duties, producing heirs and establishing alliances through her children, but by then there was only so much she could have done. Additionally, she took proactive steps to impose order in the historically turbulent Aquitaine and maintained her responsibilities as the Angevin queen, even acting as regent in various territories. It is suggested that it was Eleanor who actually initiated the separation, an action that Henry seemingly did not bother to contest. Well, the exact details of Eleanor's life in this period is a little unclear, but it is known that she and Henry had spent Christmas of 1168 apart, she being in Poitiers and he in the Argenton. In January the 6th, 1169, Henry, alongside his 2 eldest sons, met with Louis VII in Montmirail. The Treaty of Montmirail, which resulted from this meeting, had lasting effects on Henry's family, with Henry dividing his territories among his sons and arranging a marriage between Prince Richard and Louis's daughter Alice. Beyond managing his vassals and maintaining diplomatic ties with the French king, Henry was also focused on securing domestic alliances. He arranged betrothals for Geoffrey and Joanna, with Constance of Brittany and King William II of Sicily respectively, and initiated marriage negotiations for John with Alicia, the eldest daughter of Humbert III, Count of Savoy. To ensure a smooth succession, Henry sought to crown his heir, Prince Henry, despite ecclesiastical opposition. The ceremony took place in 1170 on the 14th of June, after which he was known as Henry the Young King. While Henry and Eleanor communicated during this period, they seldom saw each other, except at major celebrations like Christmas at Beurre-le-Roi near Bayeux in 1170 and at Chinon in 1172. Despite the rumors of their growing alienation, Eleanor increasingly exerted her independence in governing her duchy, notably altering her formal address to exclude the kings, referring instead to her faithful followers. So it was during this time that tensions were really ramping up between Henry II and his young sons, who were impatient to exercise the authority over the Angevin Empire territories allocated to them at Montmirail, rather than waiting for their father's demise. You know what young people are like. always in a hurry. Well, Louis VII, recognizing an opportunity to exploit these familial rifts, now that the young king was his son-in-law, invited him and Queen Margaret to Paris in November 1172 to talk about and foster the ambitions of the young and impatient king. Eleanor of Aquitaine's time in Poitiers from 1168 to 1173 is often cited as highly influential in cultural history, yet the specifics of this period remain largely unknown. Henry II was busy with his own concerns after bringing Eleanor to Poitiers, and historical narratives have long portrayed this court as a hub of chivalry and troubadour culture, an image that evolved into the notion that Eleanor, along with her daughter Marie of Champagne, oversaw what became known as the Court of Love, where the ideals of courtly love in that Arthurian and Chaucerian sense became to be known and identified. As I said before, quintessentially medieval. Well, at least the good parts of this fantasized notion of a medieval European identity. Troubadours were indeed present and composed praises for her, but the idea of the Court of Love as a formal institution was indeed a romanticized creation of later centuries. The concept largely stemmed from the late 12th century treatise titled The Art of Courtly Love by Andreas Capellanus, often described as a chaplain to Marie of Champagne, and it was written well after Eleanor's period in Poitiers, and it is agreed that the work is largely satirical. In the work Tractatus, Capellanus describes Eleanor, Marie, Ermengarde, Viscountess of Narbonne, Isabel of Flanders, and other ladies, adjudicating lovers' disputes, and acting as a jury for the questions about romantic love. He records around 21 cases, with the most famous being whether true love can exist within a marriage. Capellanus claims that ladies concluded that it was unlikely. However, there is no actual evidence to support Capellanus's depictions. In fact, Marie never visited her mother's court during this period, and the court where Capellanus wrote was antagonistic towards both Henry and Eleanor. Sorry to ruin your fun. Well, despite the inaccuracies, many popular accounts, including bibliographies like that by Polly Scheuer Brooks, still lend some credence to these tales, often suggesting they were part of a kind of parlor game. Well, either way, this notion that Eleanor had invented this term courtly love is unsubstantiated, and the term itself only emerged in the late 19th century, as much with any other romanticized tales about the old world, certainly popular at that time. Well, the concept of courtesy, a set of love-focused attitudes celebrated by troubadours, predates Eleanor's time in Poitiers. Indeed, her paternal grandfather, William IX of Aquitaine, 1071 to 1126, was a known troubadour who celebrated tales of love and chivalry long before Eleanor's era. Thus, while fin amour became popular and spread through the courts of the south in the early 12th century, and troubadours like Bernard de Ventadorn and Arnaud Guilhem de Marsan were present at her court, much of what is said about Eleanor's role in these cultural developments is speculative. Well, I think we can put that away for a while. But don't let the truth spoil your imagination. If you want to have fun thinking about these sorts of things, go ahead and do it. It's not like you're going to be submitting it to any peer review. I don't think it's any harm, unless we're making films presented as historical fact. That is crossing the line. But feel free to engage in the realm of historical fan fiction. Now, from February 21st to 28th, 1173, Henry and Eleanor were at Montferrand for the betrothal of their son Prince John to Alice of Maurienne. However, the event was overshadowed by a growing conflict between Henry II and his son, Henry the Young King, over the allocation of royal powers. After Montferrand, the royal family moved to Limoges, where tensions increased further. In March, Henry II and the young king travelled together to Chinon, arriving on March the 5th. The following morning, Henry II discovered that the young king had fled to Paris to seek the support of Louis VII, who then declared his support for the young king as the new reigning monarch. This marked the beginning of the revolt of 1173–74, a significant conflict in the reign of Henry II. Chroniclers at the time often blamed Eleanor for the conflict, because of course they did. It's just another thing that contributes to her controversial reputation, whether it be based in fact or simply because people did not like her. Do you think people would do that? Spread lies and rumors about people they don't like? Perhaps they would. Well, these people had suggested that she might have encouraged her sons to rebel, although they typically added phrases at the end such as, "so it was said," to indicate a speculative nature of these claims. But the insinuation was there. Those who wanted to believe it certainly didn't need much convincing. Confirmation bias, we call it. William of Newburgh recounted that the young king, and I quote, devised evil against his father, with the advice of Louis VII, and went to Aquitaine to incite his brothers Richard and Geoffrey to rebellion, allegedly with Eleanor's tacit approval. Thus, Richard of Hoveden provided a slightly different perspective, noting that Eleanor sent her younger sons to France to join their older brother against their father. In the spring, Eleanor attempted to travel to Paris to join her sons, but was captured en route to Chartres and taken to Henry II in Rouen. Her arrest was kept a deep secret, and she was confined for over a year in an undisclosed location. Meanwhile, Louis VII held a court in Paris, where the French nobles pledged their allegiance to the young king. Of Henry II's sons, only the young John remained loyal to his father. Hostilities thus began in May, with the forces of the young king and Louis VII invading Normandy, but neither side gained a decisive advantage in 1173. After a brief winter truce, hostilities resumed, and in May 1174, Henry II entered Poitiers. He took his daughter Joanna and other noble ladies back to his stronghold in Normandy. On July 7th, 1174, facing the threats of an invasion of England, Henry II and his party, including Eleanor, John, Joanna, and others, sailed from Barfleur to Southampton. Upon their arrival, Eleanor was taken to a place of confinement, the location of which remained unknown to the public. Despite Henry II's victory and the subsequent concessions at the Treaty of Montlouis in September of 1174, Eleanor spent much of the remainder of Henry's life under various forms of confinement in England. Her locations during this period are not well documented, though references to places like Lugershall Castle and other residences in Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, and Nottinghamshire suggest a range of confinement sites. Gerald of Wales noted that in 1175 Henry II contemplated having his marriage to Eleanor annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. He sought the counsel of a papal legate, meeting Cardinal Pierlon at Winchester, who strongly advised him against this course of action. The following year, Henry attempted to persuade Eleanor to become a nun at Fontreval, but she resisted this proposal with the support of the Archbishop of Rouen. Henry's repeated attempts to gain papal approval for these moves were ultimately unsuccessful. Meanwhile, Henry continued to use his children in diplomatic endeavors. In the summer of 1176, Eleanor was at Winchester with their daughter Joanna. Plans for Joanna's marriage to William II of Sicily were finalized, and she was sent to Sicily in August, with the marriage occurring the following February. In the same year, their son John was betrothed to Isabella of Gloucester, despite her only being 3 years old. Well, by September 1177, another of their daughters, Eleanor, was married to Alfonso VIII of Castile in Burgos, and in July 1181 their son Geoffrey was married to Constance of Brittany. Now, in terms of Eleanor of Aquitaine's confinement, it was not akin to that of a typical prisoner. Of course, it couldn't be. It was more of a form of house arrest, with her stripped of her revenues, rather, I do apologize, but gradually gaining more freedoms, particularly after 1177, and then again after 1184. It was during these years that she witnessed the deaths of 2 of her sons and her daughter Matilda, that being Henry, Geoffrey as well of those sons. Details about these years are sparse, and Eleanor's relationship with her sons became increasingly strained, particularly with Richard, who was reportedly her favourite, as Henry was wary of any communication that might lead to plotting against him. Eleanor was thus rarely allowed to see her sons, though she was occasionally released for special occasions, such as Easter of 1176. Queen Eleanor's bower near Shrewsbury and close to Ormond Alley is believed to be one of her places of confinement during this time. The deaths of Rosamund Clifford in 1176 at Godstow, Oxfordshire, led to enduring myths about Eleanor's involvement in her death, myths that became part of this so-called Black Legend of Eleanor, despite a lack of contemporary evidence to support such claims. Henry thus built a tomb for Rosamund in the abbey, and made large donations in her memory. chroniclers like Gerald of Wales and Roger of Hoveden wrote that Henry began an affair with the young Alice of France around this time, which complicated matters because she was married, well, betrothed at this time, to her son Richard. Well, this affair, of course, alarmed Louis VII, as Alice was his daughter. Very scandalous, isn't it? Henry's delay of the marriage, which Richard opposed, led to Alice bearing Henry several children. Well, the death of Henry the Young on 11th of June 1183 in Martel, at the age of 28 from dysentery, profoundly affected Eleanor. His dying wish was for his mother's freedom and the welfare of his queen. In response, Henry II sent Thomas Agnell, the Archdeacon of Wells, to inform Eleanor about her son's death. Reportedly, she already knew. She had a premonition of this event in a dream. Mother's intuition, perhaps. Not always giving us the best of news. Well, years later, she shared with Pope Celestine III how this loss had tormented her. An event that shifted the family dynamic, making Richard now the primary heir. Well, the death also triggered disputes over Queen Margaret's lands, and between Henry II and Philip II, her half-brother. Philip claimed that certain properties in Normandy and England that Henry asserted were Eleanor's and should revert to her upon her son's death. This necessitated Eleanor's presence in the disputed regions, leading to a relaxation of her confinement. Finally, she can get out of the house. Well, Roger of Hoveden noted that Henry commanded her to be free to tour her lands, improving her income significantly. The renegotiation of the Treaty of Montmirail and Richard's contentious betrothal to Alice required a meeting between the English and the French kings at Gisors in December of 1183. Henry revoked many of the previous land concessions. Eleanor returned to England then in early 1184, where her daughter Matilda and her exiled husband joined her. At Winchester, Matilda gave birth to her fifth child, William. Eleanor and Henry tried to mediate their sons' conflicts, but without success, spending Christmas at Windsor. In 1185, Eleanor and Henry travelled to Normandy for a family council, remaining there for nearly a year. Despite her limited freedom to act in Aquitaine, she was clearly under the influence of Henry and their sons Richard, Geoffrey, and John. The death of Geoffrey in August of 1186 in Paris left only Richard and John as heirs, intensifying their conflict over the inheritance. Richard's efforts to incorporate Toulouse into Aquitaine led to direct conflict between Henry and Philip, resulting in a combined force of Richard and Philip against an increasingly frail Henry. This forced Henry to relinquish much of his French holdings. Henry's health deteriorated after John joined the alliance against him, and he died at Chinon on the 6th of July, 1189. Around this time, Eleanor also learned of Matilda's death. Over her last years with Henry, Eleanor travelled with him and participated in governing, though she remained under the custodianship and was never fully free. Henry's death had marked the end of their complex marriage and Eleanor's long imprisonment, paving the way for her to play a more active role in the years that she had left. Upon the death of Henry, Richard became the uncontested heir to the throne. One of his initial actions as king was to order William Marshal to immediately release his mother from imprisonment. Upon Marshal's arrival in England, he found that Eleanor had already been released by her custodians. At 65 years old, Eleanor immediately assumed the role of regent of England, acting in Richard's stead while he remained in France. Eleanor travelled to Westminster and received oaths of loyalty from numerous lords and prelates on behalf of the new king, signing herself as Eleanor by the grace of God, Queen of England. Now that's a signature with some weight of authority, don't you think? On August the 13th, 1189, Richard arrived in Portsmouth from Barfleur and was greeted with great enthusiasm. From 1190 to 1194, Richard I was largely absent from England, first participating in the Third Crusade from 1190 to 92, and subsequently being held captive by Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor. During this period, royal authority in England was formally exercised by a council of regency alongside a series of chief justiciars. William de Longchamp from 1190-91, Walter de Coutances from 1191 to 93, and followed by Hubert Walker. Although Eleanor did not hold a formal office during Richard's absence, she arrived in England with Coutances in June of 1191, and wielded significant influence over English affairs and the actions of Prince John until Richard's return. She was indeed instrumental in raising the ransom demanded by Henry VI for Richard's release, and played a key role in the negotiations with the Holy Roman Emperor that ultimately secured her son's freedom. Her influence is also evident in the numerous letters she wrote to Pope Celestine III regarding Richard's captivity. One of her letters from 1193 expresses her deep personal suffering due to her son's imprisonment, writing and using the words that she was wasted away by sorrow due to the ordeal, as any mother would be. We can all agree on that. Well, she outlived her son Richard, who died in 1199, and then saw the reign of her youngest son, King John, in the same year. A truce between Philip II of France and John led to an agreement that Philip's 12-year-old heir, Louis, would marry one of John's nieces, the daughters of his sister, Eleanor of England, Queen of Castile. Eleanor of Aquitaine, then 77 years old, was tasked by John to travel to Castile to choose one of his nieces as the bride. Well, despite her advanced age, Eleanor set out from Poitiers. Shortly after her departure, however, she was ambushed and captured by Hugh IX of Lusignan. Eleanor negotiated her release by agreeing to his demands and continued her journey, crossing the Pyrenees into the kingdoms of Navarre and Castile. And by the end of January 1200, she arrived in Castile, safe and sound. Eleanor's daughter, Queen Eleanor of Castile, had two unmarried daughters of her own, Urraca and Blanche. Eleanor chose the younger daughter, Blanche, for the marriage, and after a 2-month stay at the Castilian court, Eleanor journeyed back across the Pyrenees with her granddaughter Blanche. They celebrated Easter in Bordeaux, where the famous warrior Mercadier came to escort them north. Tragically, Mercadier was killed shortly after by a rival mercenary, a blow that profoundly affected Eleanor. Too fatigued to continue to Normandy, she and Blanche travelled slowly to the Loire Valley, where Eleanor entrusted Blanche to the Archbishop of Bordeaux and retired to Fontevraud Abbey. Eleanor's health declined in early 1201. When war broke out between John and Philip II, Eleanor supported John and travelled from Fontevraud to Poitiers to prevent her grandson Arthur I, Duke of Brittany, from seizing control. Arthur, a rival to John for the English throne, besieged Eleanor at Mirabeau. John quickly had marched to her rescue, captured Arthur, and likely his sister Eleanor, the fair maid of Brittany. Following this, Eleanor returned to Fontevraud and took the veil to live out the rest of her days as a nun. 3 years later, on March 31st, 1204, Eleanor had passed away. She was buried in Fontevraud Abbey alongside Henry II, Richard I, and her daughter Joan. Her tomb effigy, depicting her reading a Bible and adorned with representations of exquisite jewelry, is one of the finest surviving from this period. However, during the chaos of the French Revolution, the abbey was ransacked, the tombs destroyed, and the bones of Eleanor, Henry, Richard, Joan, and Isabella of Angoulême were scattered and lost. By her death, Eleanor had outlived all of her children, except King John of England, who would die some 12 years later in 1216. And she didn't quite outlive Queen Eleanor of Castile either, who went on to do her own royal duties for quite some time. Well, thank you very much for listening. You know, when I wrote the video and, well, when I looked at the script, I realized that it was going to be extremely long. I didn't think it was going to be an hour and a half, but, well, here we are. A few of you had suggested that I do Eleanor of Aquitaine, so I have done it. Least you can do is, I suppose, press the like button. I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons, Britt, Charles, Jeffrey, Stark Factory, and JC, and I'd like to wish you all the best. I will see you tomorrow for another exciting video. Good night, everyone. Love you all dearly.